Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing the case of a former U.S. Air Force intelligence analyst, Daniel Hale, who whistleblew about information regarding American drone strikes, this time regarding many of the drone strikes that have taken place in Afghanistan, more specifically, especially under the Obama-era secret program. Of course, Obama is the one who heightened, I should say, the drone program. It had begun, I believe, under George W. Bush himself. Nevertheless, Daniel Hale said that it was against his moral conscience to continue in this regard, and that he felt guilty for the fact that, in his opinion at least, 9 out of 10 of the times that drones were used or are used, even now, that the innocent are killed many of those times. Now, the judge, in passing the charges against him, the sentence against him of 45 months, has said that he's not being sentenced for the fact that he took a moral stand, but he's been sentenced for the fact that he leaked secret documents. And the U.S. government side and their lawyers that said that those documents, in fact, endangered the United States, considering, at least in their words, the Islamic State and other terror groups may very well have gotten a hold of them. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Danaka, Katovich, who is a Middle East and Peace Collective Coordinator with Code Pink. She's joining us this morning from Chicago, Illinois. Joining us from Reston, Virginia, is Dr. Rollie, who is an Associate Professor in International Affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. And joining us from St. Paul, Minnesota, is Coleen Rowley, who is a retired FBI agent, former Minneapolis FBI Division Legal Counsel. She's also taught ethics and constitutional law to FBI agents and police. Coleen, Rollie, and Danaka, good morning to all three of you, and thank you to all three of you for joining us today. Danaka, let me start with you first. What do you make of the case of Daniel Hale? I mean, his 11-page, I think it was, testimony and letter really was quite a powerful statement.
Yeah, definitely. I think Daniel Hale is an American hero. He saw something egregious happening that the American people were being lied to about by our own government, and he thought that we needed to know what was happening. Daniel's statement was very, very powerful, and I think the American people owe him a debt of gratitude for what he did. I think the prosecution, the government, was asked multiple times to prove some sort of harm that Daniel's disclosures caused, and they were never able to. They tried to claim that the Islamic State got a hold of Daniel's documents, but Daniel's lawyers yesterday at the sentencing got Harry Cooper, who is a former CIA, who formerly worked for the CIA, said if the Islamic State had some sort of information that would be harmful to the United States, they probably wouldn't publicize it. So I think the general takeaway is that we are very glad that Daniel's sentence wasn't as long as the prosecution was asking for, but prosecuting whistleblowers under the Espionage Act sends a very dangerous message to what the United States government thinks about truth and how they value truth.
Rollie, your thoughts on this, because there is, on the government side, the argument of national security and harming national security if you release classified documents. And to a very large extent, I would think that makes sense to all of us, right? Where certainly there probably are certain documents out there that should not be seen by everyone in the public or everyone in the world, especially adversaries. But then on the other side, there's the argument of transparency, specifically when it comes to civilian casualties caused because of drone strikes. What are your thoughts on both those arguments? Where do you stand?
It is a difficult question. There is a reason that documents are classified and national security needs to be protected. And of course, sources and so forth need to be protected. Having said that, we do always need to also think of the public interest. And in that sense, on balance, what is possibly being harmed by the release or opening of the information in these documents relative to what the whistleblower is actually saying. And I would say in this particular case, it seems that they have not proven harm to be done in any significant way by the release of the documents. And yet he has done, I believe also, I agree, a public service in saying that, hey, this is not an effective program. Not only is it completely ineffective by having 90% of the shots killing wrong people, civilian people, but also that it's a human rights abuse. And we really need to be thinking about that more deeply. What are we trying to do with the drone program? What are also our ultimate goals in terms of national? I think we really just need to think of national security more broadly, not just in terms of a document. We need to think, how are we protecting our national security with the drone program as a whole? Is it protecting our security? Or is it really just making so many people mad at us that we're recruiting more terrorists? And I think that is a bigger question that does not get taken up. Instead, we end up being, kind of bogged down in the details of, oh no, this document was released. But we need to think about the bigger issue.
Coleen, I wanted to, in fact, ask you that. The fact that if we have so many innocents being killed by these drones, that just gives fodder, doesn't it, to any terror group out there to recruit the left-behind family members. So, I mean, in many ways, this is having a counterproductive effect, where we're saying this is to protect national security, but this is probably in some ways actually endangering homeland security.
Yeah, I would say that the proof of the fact that this is very counterproductive is the fact that the United States has not won any hearts and minds in Afghanistan. Right now, the U.S. is, of course, being forced to pull out after 20 years. The whole goal was to stabilize the country, and if you are actually working at cross purposes by making people madder and madder, it's never going to work. So I would totally agree that the broader issue of national security requires transparency to a large extent. Because if you allow a small number of people, especially those who are vested in having orchestrated wars to begin with, and now you're letting them after 20 years make the decisions, and they've been proven wrong, and you're not having any intelligence on the part of even the public to understand this, then it's just doomed. And about maybe 1% of these documents should be classified. Landing on D-Day in Normandy or whatever, that maybe has to be secret for a short time. But these things don't have to be secret for very long, and especially when they're proving counterproductive.
Yeah. In today's day and age, so we're talking about 2021, do you think that the U.S. government has learned the lesson? Do you think that there are more checks and balances probably in place? We would not know this 100% certainly, but I'm just saying, in your guesstimation, do you think the lessons have been learned over the years ever since Obama really heightened these drone strikes?
I don't think so. The United States is still very involved in the Middle East, and their primary form of interaction has still been drones. I'm pretty sure the Trump administration went back and started reclassifying young teenage boys as military age males again, so enemy combatants, which is highly problematic and causes more issues with the truth. Like, we don't actually know how many civilians have been killed by U.S. drone strikes because of the way they count civilian casualties.
Rollie, I'm wondering what kind of a role the arms industry, and I know I'm using a very general term here, plays in how the U.S. government views drones, right? Because they've been sold to all of us around the world as these very precise tools that they really get the job done, that they always hit their target. Is it the fact that that has been so oversold to everybody, including American citizens and the rest of us around the world, that it's really hard to walk that back now?
I mean, that may be part of it, though I do think that we do have a good amount of precision at times. Now, having said that, there are two different factors here. One is how precise is an actual strike, and yes, it may not be as precise as they're saying it is. In addition to that is how precise is our intelligence. That is, for example, we're saying that's a terrorist there and his terrorist buddies, but is it really a terrorist and his buddies, or is it he and his family, or a wedding party, or whatever it might be? So how precise is the intelligence we're using for the strike? And then thirdly, that's assuming that, if we have the intelligence that it's the terrorist and his family or other civilians, that we are being as honorable as possible in our decision making. So now we're talking about precision of decision making. For example, if there are 6 or 7 civilians there, are we actually making the decision saying, you know what, this isn't a good time to make that strike. Let's protect the civilians and see if we can catch him later. Or are we saying, hey, we're okay with that. Let's take them all out because we got our target. So the question is, how is that decision-making being done? So there's precision that needs to be looked at a variety of levels. And I think that we have some flawed decision-making on all 3 of those levels.
Coleen, one wonders, and I have been following this story ever since the Daniel Hale case came out last year and even the year before, I believe, that there hasn't been a lot of uproar. I mean, I know this happens often with whistleblowers, but I mean, Edward Snowden is probably an anomaly where there was significant uproar. Same with Assange, in the sense that there was a significant amount of support, public support, and even to a very certain extent within mainstream media as well as part of certain experts. But this has, for a very large part, gone under the radar, where it's not like front page necessarily throughout. Does that mean that the U.S. public doesn't care, is unaware? What's really going on?
Well, the propaganda in the United States is pretty significant for pro-war, and the costs are very low. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Obama went to aerial bombing and drone warfare, because it was recognized that the American public would not care as long as you reduce casualties. And of course, there's no taxes to pay for the wars and no draft. So there's a lot of reasons why Americans are pretty sleepwalking about this, However, I would say that Daniel Hale's actions, especially in these last couple of days, which has actually reached mainstream media, has been a victory for moral conscience, because some of our mainstream media, the Washington Post and some magazines, have covered this story just in the last couple of days. And what Daniel Hale wanted to show was the trauma of war and the blowback even to the U.S. in the terms of the suicidal, about 20 some veterans now are committing suicide every day. And Daniel Hale actually feels so guilty that he wants to pay for having been a part of this. He's apologized many times. So I think, even though he's doing 45 months in prison, the whole thing he cared about, which was getting this information out to the American public and showing that that there is a path for moral conscience. There is a path here that we can reduce these wrongful actions. And absolutely, when you're doing indiscriminate killing, because of a bad intelligence or because just the drone hits a certain area, that is a terrible wrongful action. So I think that maybe there is some hope here at the end of the tunnel.
Speaking about Danaka, I wanted to get your thoughts about the judgment, because the judge, and I'm going to try to quote him directly now, said, or her, I haven't seen his name, but said that Hale was, quote, not being prosecuted for speaking out about the drone program killing innocent people, and that he in fact could have been a whistleblower, in the judge's opinion, without taking any of these documents. Do you agree with that? I mean, do you think Hale should not have taken these what are classified documents and made them public?
I think Daniel did what he thought was right at the time. I think the information that was leaked to The Intercept was of great public importance for people to know. And I just want to add that there was this article that came out in New York Magazine called The Drone Leaker about Daniel. I think it's a really beautiful piece everyone should read, that it really explains why he did what he did and why the documents were leaked were the ones chosen. But it's important, I think, to talk about that Daniel never, ever wanted this to be about him. He feels immense guilt, like others today have said, for ever taken part in the U.S. drone program. But he always emphasizes the focus on the victims of the drone war. He always wants it to be about them, so much so that his friends had to have an intervention to get him to participate in his own defense and tell his story. And one thing, Daniel gave a very beautiful testimony at the sentencing yesterday. I'll try and quote it directly, but he said something to the effect of, Your Honor, please forgive me for having taken papers and not human life.
Indeed, that was a statement. And Rollie, you know, I wonder what the message is then on the part of the judiciary and this judge, more specifically. 45 months, yes, I mean, it's still a sentence, but it's not the worst sentence that could have been passed for Hale. Do you think that in many ways means that, I don't know, there's more understanding possibly on the part of this judge and judiciary of what this man tried to do, and that they're not completely averse to it?
Yeah, actually, I do think so. You know, because coming into it, we were looking at the possibility of 11 years, and I was concerned that that might be the verdict. But when they came, basically thought some sympathy for what he has done, and I agree. I think that people can see that he had a lot of facts behind him on this, and there is a solid reason for whistleblowing here. And so I think that the judge agreed, possibly, maybe, with the ultimate goal, but had to provide a punishment for the release of classified documents. Now, having said that, if he had not used the classified documents, I actually think that he would have had a lot of trouble getting believed by the public, by the government. People would have immediately said, oh, you're making this up, you know, where's the proof? So, I mean, it's very easy after the fact to say, oh, well, you know, you shouldn't have released the documents. Why didn't you just say what you had to say? Well, you know, I can see where his logic was coming from.
I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. Let's speak about what then this holds for the future of whistleblowing in the U.S., because there are arguments, even in the articles that I read today, about how this is meant to stifle people from then, you know, ensuring that their respective government, i.e. the American government, remains transparent or is then transparent even in a forced fashion about these things. Is there hope in that regard?
Well, I'll just add that not only would Daniel Hale probably not have been believed or gotten any of this information out, but also he would have had a target on his back. There are many whistleblowers who actually tried everything. They went to the proper internal authorities. Eventually, they, you know, even gave speeches without classified information, and they still ended up being prosecuted under that old 1917 World War I Espionage Act. This act was reinterpreted to go, instead of going after, you know, outright spies like FBI agent Robert Hansen, it was twisted first by under the Obama administration. I should say it was tried to be twisted to go after Daniel Ellsberg for having released the Pentagon Papers, but it failed. And no courts have really gone there. However, these administrations, beginning with Obama, started using that Espionage Act, you know, to deter information coming out from some very unethical, if not outright illegal actions that were occurring, and including torture, for instance. So they use that act, and now it needs to be reformed. So the public should, the momentum here should be to reform the old 1917 Espionage Act so that it's not merely to repress opinions, anti-war opinions, etc. It has been abused, and it should be used only for actual spying from a foreign country, not to go after publishers, not to go after the press, as it's being abused right now.
All right, we're at that, but we really appreciate Coleen, Rollie, and Danaka for taking their time out this morning to share their expertise with us. We were discussing there the case of Daniel Hale, and one important FYI is that Hale is actually descendant of Nathan Hale, who is an American patriot who was hanged, in fact, for the British for stealing documents all the way back in 1776. And the reason I bring that up is because Hale, Daniel Hale, that is, quoted his ancestor while addressing the court on Tuesday, and he said, "My only regret is that I have but one life to give to my country, whether here or in prison." And then he ended off his statement by saying, "I believe that it is wrong to kill, but it is especially wrong to kill the defenseless." I'll leave it there for that. With that topic, I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Iraq, and President Biden of the United States has announced an end to the U.S. combat mission in Iraq. But for many, this is more just a rebranding, because it's not like the U.S. was already involved in combat for a while now, at least, in Iraq, and it was playing an advisory role anyways in training Iraqi forces. So what's really behind this? A lot would point the fingers at Al-Kadhimi, who is the Iraqi leader, saying that he is under immense political pressure within the country to announce some sort of an end of American combat operations in Iraq, especially in the wake of the Soleimani assassination, as well as probably a whole host of other reasons that he is under pressure to end the U.S. operations as such in Iraq. What does this then mean going forward, though? Because at the same time that this was announced, Al-Kadhimi did also make it clear that Iraq very much still needs U.S. support in the country. And so the number of troops that are there in advisory role is not actually changing. And Al-Kadhimi sort of is trying to play both sides. Will he be able to do this successfully? Because this has been tried before, too, by some past Iraqi leaders. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're now joined by Zeidon Alkinani, who is a political analyst, researcher on Iraq and the Middle East. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen. He is joining us today from Doha in Qatar. Joining us this morning from Holliston, Massachusetts is Frank Sobchak, who is a retired colonel. He is a PhD candidate in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Frank and Zeidon, thank you both for taking your time out today to discuss this with us. Zeidon, let me start with you. The U.S. is not really ending anything in Iraq, right? I mean, this is just for the sake of public consumption?
Well, it is more of a decision on paper rather than in practice, just like many other U.S. foreign policies in Iraq and the beyond region, in particular when it comes to the U.S. military withdrawals from Iraq. And unfortunately, we're seeing that the strategic dialogue between Washington and Baghdad has fallen a victim to many unnecessary discussions with a lack of clear objectives. We could look at it as through the lens of that the Biden administration and Kadhimi's government might not theoretically be in favor for a full U.S. military withdrawal now or in the future from Iraq. But I think what they're doing is that they're both following an overarching agendas by their own respective governments with an attempt to overlap with one another, considering that they have a lot of agreements at the same time. While Biden is promoting less troops abroad in both Afghanistan and Iraq, Kadhimi must be the parliamentary vote, which is Iraq's parliamentary vote to expel U.S. forces from the country in early January 2020. So, in other words, it could be seen as an attempt by the Biden administration to support Kadhimi's image in Iraq prior to the early elections that are supposed to happen this October, as a compromise to the anti-government October protest movement. This, however, doesn't necessarily mean that Prime Minister Kadhimi nor his former predecessors, such as former Prime Minister Adil Abdel Mahdi, had real incentives to push away U.S. troops from Iraq upon the parliamentary vote. It's probably because it was, after all, the parliamentary vote was a responsive act to the pressures of the pro-Iran camp in Iraq's parliament, whom were seeking revenge for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the former leader of Quds Force, of IRGC, and PMF's former de facto leader, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis.
You know, there have been a lot of very alarming headlines on the part of some people saying that, oh, you know, the Americans are handing Iraq over to the Iranians to do as they so wish. But I mean, that's very simple to say, but it's not that in reality, is it? Because as we know, I mean, the number of troops remaining on the ground in advisory/training roles is still very much the same. So, I mean, American influence is actually not changing in Iraq at all, is it?
Yeah, so I really agree that this is much more of a semantic change. It's much more of a rebranding than really changing anything on the ground. And in many ways, you almost have to look at really what is not changing as opposed to what is changing. And the things that are not changing are that the primary mission is still going to be advising Iraqi forces, that there will be intelligence given, that airstrikes are allowed as long as the Iraqi government supports them, and that special operations forces are still going to be conducting operations partnered with the counterterrorism service. The Iraqi Special Operations Forces, probably the most capable and effective force in Iraq. Coalition and U.S. Special Operations Forces are still going to be paired and partnered with them. Additionally, the footprint, the size of the U.S. presence in Iraq at this point, which is about 2,500 soldiers, is not set to change. There are some kind of discussions, the typical kind of background discussion that you hear from the, quote, senior administration official who is saying that, there are ongoing discussions about what the footprint will look like. But at this point, really nothing has changed. Not much has changed. And it is a rebranding, most likely for kind of domestic political audiences, both within the United States and within Iraq, in my opinion.
What does this then mean for Iraq, right? So we've had this rebranding. Nothing's really changing on the ground as such because the U.S. has been in this role anyhow, advisory training. What does this mean vis-a-vis Iraq's relations with Iran as well? I mean, is it, as people are saying, that, the Americans just handing Iraq over to the Iranians on a silver platter, essentially?
Well, of course, the Iran factor has been very problematic since the early stages of the U.S. invasion in Iraq. There are many stages since 2003 where people are considering Iran increasing and benefiting from the U.S. occupation of Iraq by increasing its influence across different sectors of the Iraqi state and Iraqi society. Before we look into this from the Iraqi lenses, we have to look at it through the lenses of the U.S. administration. As to understand it through Biden's own perspective, this is probably part of a wider Biden strategy in the Middle East and the Near East to aim to shift the focus away from, the Middle East and the so-called terrorism and, invest more focus into their own threats that they consider from China and the cyber warfare. But ending America's post-9/11 era by withdrawing troops from both Afghanistan and Iraq, even if it meant, the accurate and efficient security reforms not being in place in both countries, means they're doing the exact opposite job. So whatever, project they were aiming for, a successful project they were aiming for, the exact opposite outcome will happen. It's despite the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan being a fraught topic in Washington, in Iraq, the U.S. military withdrawal is likely to cause very different difficulties and not the same. And that is because, as we previously mentioned, the announcement is unlikely in practice to remove many of the 2,500 U.S. troops that are currently stationed there, as your guest mentioned.
Yeah.
Biden is aware that a change in U.S. troop designation is very unlikely to halt confrontations between the U.S. and Iran-backed militias in Iraq. So that makes us question the level of responsibility the U.S. government carries towards Iraq when they, present themselves as major partners with Iraq during these strategic dialogue discussions. So this rushed and unstudied decision is part of a typical and common and long U.S. military strategy in the region. The U.S. military intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan should have ended a very long time ago. In Iraq's case, since that's our topic, it could have ended at the U.S. invasion's ability in toppling the former dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and leave a democratic transition gradually managed by Iraq's own people. And yet they decided to remain in the country despite not finding the alleged weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
And Saddam Hussein was caught. And they continue to destroy the infrastructure, abolish the state institutions, damage the police and the armed forces, which eventually left the Iraq we know of today, a vulnerable, unsecured country with very unsecured borders, which motivated neighboring regional power players like Iran to exploit. ISIS originated from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the Iran-backed militias would have not existed in Iraq if the U.S. military intervention was only limited to the regime change element. So Iraq's current security position is weaker than ever, with not only sleeping cells of ISIS, but even proxy networks driven by regional powers destabilizing the country based on the agenda of its proxy rulers. Yes, it would be very ideal to wish for a sovereign Iraq to handle its own problems beyond Iran and the US, but leaving a more vulnerable Iraq to Iran, much more vulnerable Iraq than it was in front of Iran and after 2003, makes it a bit unfair and unjust to leave a very weak military establishment destroyed from the occupation to face
Zeidon, let me come in then. I think you made some very, very pertinent points there. Frank, in some ways, I'm going to use this phrase, and I can certainly have you disagree with me if you want, but it seems like the U.S. is trying to cut its losses and just leave the region as a whole. Now, as Zeidon there correctly pointed out, certainly Afghanistan and Iraq are not the exact same situation, but nevertheless, there are certain similarities that we can see about these decisions that are being made right now, at least on the part of the Biden administration. Is this the responsible way for the U.S. to do things?
So I do agree that, like, from a domestic kind of political lens, there is definitely pressure on the Biden administration to kind of withdraw from the post 9/11 wars across the Middle East and Near East. That said, Iraq and Afghanistan are very different, present very different strategic situations for the United States. In my opinion, and in the opinion of many, I think, strategists in Washington, D.C., Afghanistan does not present a true strategic interest to the United States. And so withdrawing from there, in the mind of many strategists, is the right thing to do. Kind of really for the United States and in some ways for Afghanistan also, because our presence there basically presents opportunities for many foreign fighters to kind of continue to return to Afghanistan, to continue to the fight, and it provides recruitment opportunities also across the kind of global jihadist extremist network. Secondly, within Iraq, I agree the challenge is I agree very much that the only country really that benefited from the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq was Iran, and that Iraq is in such a much weaker state, in such a fractured state, as a result of the United States invasion, that withdrawing would be irresponsible. Withdrawing completely would be irresponsible. It also still maintains a strategic interest for the United States, both as presenting some sort of counterweight to Iran, as well as trying to block some of Iranian efforts to secure the Shia Crescent and to secure kind of like an axis of resistance across Iraq into Syria and Lebanon, potentially even creating a land bridge to the Mediterranean. Iraq, within U.S. interest and U.S. military and strategic perspective, it would be kind of not responsible to withdraw, both from that perspective as well as the perspective of that Iraq is very much weakened. We effectively, the United States involvement helped set off a civil war previously. And, further withdrawal could potentially spark that again. Now,
Frank, I'm going to come in. I do apologize because we're just being joined by our third guest who's been able to connect with us now. We're now joined by Dr. Mubarak Awad, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. as an adjunct professorial lecturer at the School of International Service at the American University. He's the president of Nonviolence International as well. Mubarak, thank you very much for taking your time out this morning for joining us from Washington. I wanted to get your thoughts about this rebranding of the American role in Iraq. Is it also in some ways the need for the Americans to leave the region, or to at least make it seem like they're leaving the region? What does that then leave behind?
I'm glad to see that there are so many things that have to do with the U.S. and Iraq. And I think that there is a history in regarding to the U.S. and the invasion of Iraq. think we have to start that with the Bush administration and their rationale to have a war with Iraq. And it's a threat from the United States, which is unbelievable that they went to the UN and the whole idea was completely false. And unfortunately, so many people die in that meantime between the Americans and the Iraqis.
So, Mubarak, then there's this whole argument right now that if the Americans were to leave, which are not actually leaving Iraq, I mean, they're still very much maintaining the same number of troops in the advisory training role, but that by them leaving, that this hands Iraq over to the Iranians. Is there some legitimacy to that argument, in your opinion?
I think the United States started the whole concept that it's over there to protect its allies in the region. And the allies are Israel, and they want to protect it from Iran. So the best way in protection is to control Iraq and to get rid of Saddam Hussein. If the United States leaves, this is the best thing for Iraq. I mean, the fact that the United States through the UN on Iraq is terrible. It's terrible, killing so many people. And it's destroying the Iraqi culture, the Iraqi concept of freedom, the Iraqi spirit. And nobody in that area wants to be occupied by another country. And it will be to the interest of the United States as well as the interest of Iraq to really change ways of dealing with the issue. And the conflict can be resolved easily. It's not a problem over there. And if Iraq leaves, okay, it's not that Iraq goes to fall completely under Iran. Iraq and Iran have a history of peace and war and all the things.
Yeah.
It's like any other thing in the region, but it should not be controlled by United States or any other foreign country. I think this idea of invading other countries should stop from large countries or powerful countries like Russia and the United States.
Okay, so we'll have to leave there as a final word. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We will try to continue this discussion. Of course, I'm sure Zeidon and Frank may have had more to say, but we appreciate all three of our guests, Mubarak, Zeidon, and Frank, for taking their time out of their busy schedules to speak to us today and to share their expertise with us. We were discussing there this rebranding, essentially, of the U.S. role in Iraq in an advisory training role. It's been doing that anyways, so this is more seemingly for domestic Iraqi politics and even domestic American politics, where in Iraq, there is very little appetite for continuing American combat operations, at least. And then on the American side, there's just complete lack of appetite for continuous wars overseas anyhow. And we've seen that in the decision that Biden has made with Afghanistan as well, speeding up the withdrawal from that country. Where does this leave Iraq, though, as a country that Zeidon described very well, with very weak infrastructure at this point in time and a very weak governing system as well, if we're completely honest? Can Iraq govern itself? Can it move forward independently, or will it then fall prey, because it is so weak infrastructure-wise, to regional countries that will be battling it out, over influence over the country, because, again, the Americans are seemingly wanting to wash their hands of the situation? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.